Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka nabina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajmain. So welcome to the first meeting after Ramadan, our first gathering after Ramadan of the Monday meeting. And tonight, what I thought we would do was contemplate some of the lessons that we could have learned, perhaps should have learned, can continue to learn from this great act of ibadah and this great sha'ira that we just completed, Shahr Ramadan al-Mubarak, as well as talk about the ahkam, the rules and regulations for fasting, the 6 days of Shawwal. So we'll begin with some of the lessons. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, فَاعْتَبِرُوا يَا أُولِي الْأَبْصَارِ, which basically could be translated to mean, so pay heed and learn a lesson, O you who have been given eyes with which to see. And that comes from Surah Al-Hashr, the 59th chapter, verse number 2. فَاعْتَبِرُوا يَا أُولِي الْأَبْصَارِ. So consider, pay heed and learn a lesson, O you who have been given eyes with which to see. Scholars of tafsir, when they comment on this verse, one of the things that has been mentioned in terms of what Allah is asking us to do is they said al-ayatu tadamman al-amr bit-tafakkur فيما تضمنته الأحكام من المعاني والحكم. They've said that the command to ponder, or this ayah, it contains the command to ponder what the rituals of Islam contain of meanings and wisdom. So in other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is instructing the believers in this ayah to contemplate, to ponder, and not to be heedless, not to be the people who take no benefit, not to be from the people who learn absolutely nothing from the acts of worship that He has ordered us to perform. Now this obviously, so basically in a roundabout way, Allah is saying these acts of worship that you do, for example, prayer. What's the meaning of prayer? Why do we pray? What lessons, what life skills can you take from prayer? Somebody give me an example. What's a life skill or a lesson that you can take from prayer and the way prayer is structured? Tafadhal. Like submission is good. Give me something like a life skill, something like a practical thing.
Routine.
Routine. Excellent. Somebody piggyback off a routine. What is a prayer?
Discipline.
Okay, discipline is good. That's very good. So all of these are good answers. But if you piggyback off a routine, it tells you to be on time, right? And that there should be a time for things. And that if you set a time for things, you should do those things in time. You guys see that? How we can study the prayer and learn from it that a Muslim is supposed to be a person who cares about time, who manages their time well, sets times for things, and performs those things in time. You see that? And so we contemplate we go beyond just as-Saafiy. We go beyond what is on the surface, the shallow apparent meanings, the low-hanging fruit, and we look and we think in depth, what is Allah saying to us by prescribing X, Y, and Z from the rituals? And Ramadan is no exception. Ramadan is no exception to that. Upon leaving the month of Ramadan, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to reflect. What should we learn from Ramadan? How can Ramadan's lessons be recognized and implemented in such a way that in the months that follow, noticeable changes occur in our lives? And we become better Muslims after Ramadan than we were before Ramadan, right? That it actually impacts us beyond the actual month in which we were performing the ritual of fasting and everything that goes with it. So what I've done is I've compiled a list of 8 lessons that we'll comment on. I won't say that these are the only lessons, but these are 8 that occurred to me as I reflected upon the month of Ramadan. So one of the lessons that every Muslim should take from Ramadan as they reflect upon it and everything that it contains is that we have been created to worship Allah. That is the primary purpose of our existence. It is the principal duty that we owe to our Creator, and therefore it should be our number 10 priority, right? It should be our 10th priority, right? It should be our what? Number 1 priority, because that's the purpose of it. How do we see that from Ramadan? Just take a step back and ponder all the acts of worship that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or His Prophet have asked us to do or encouraged us to do in Ramadan. Think about it. 1, obviously, fasting. In addition to that, it's the month of the Quran. Supposed to read a lot of the Quran. Complete the reading of the Quran, and if you can complete it twice, thrice. Read as much Quran as possible. Make as many complete readings of the Quran as possible. Night prayer. Obviously, night prayer is prescribed throughout the year, but especially what? In Ramadan. Ad-du'a. وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِي عَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيب. Right in the middle of the verses about fasting, Allah inserts an ayah where He tells us to what? To make du'a. Lets us know that what? Du'a and fasting go hand in hand. To the point the Prophet said, لِلصَّائِمِ دَعْوَةٌ لَا تُرَدْ. Right? That the person who's fasting has a supplication that won't be rejected, won't be turned back, won't be denied. Dhikr. We're encouraged to what? To remember Allah a lot throughout the year, but especially what? In Ramadan. And we've been given special adhkar that we're supposed to say in Ramadan. One of them being the one that we say when we're seeking Laylatul Qadr, which is, somebody remind me, Allahumma innaka afuwun tuhibbul afwa fa'fu anni, right? Making charitable donations. كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أجود الناس وكان أجود ما يكون في شوال أجود ما يكون في محرم أجود ما يكون في رمضان. It's a month of what? The month of what? Al-Jud wal-Karam. The month in which we're supposed to what? We're supposed to exert ourselves in what? In being charitable. Like the Prophet's example, like the example of the Prophet that he set. Also add to that, providing food in general. Feeding people. People, climbing over each other to get their name on the list of people who will host iftar. Feeding people what? In general, because feeding people is one of the very rewardable acts. Especially feeding what? As-Saafiy. Wait, before we get there, as-Saafiy. Why? Because every poor person, you give them food to break their fast, what do you get? I'm sorry, not poor person. Every fasting person that you give food to break their fast, what do you get? You get the reward for their fasting, even though that doesn't decrease their reward. Add to that the feeding of what? Of the poor. The feeding of the poor in general, and specifically toward the end of Ramadan, zakat, al-fitr. You guys see that? Also seclusion in the mosques. Al-i'tikaf, which is prescribed throughout the year, but especially is prescribed in the month of Ramadan, to the point the Prophet ﷺ used to spend the last 10 days in i'tikaf, and at the end of his life, he spent what? The entire month of Ramadan, right? In i'tikaf, right? طيب. So, if you think about all of this, most of us did some, if not all, of these acts of worship in what? In Ramadan. We were keen to do them, even though they're not what? Our regular practice. Right? They're not our regular practice. If we look at our regular life in the other 11 months, we're not doing most of these things. If we are doing them, we're not doing them with the level of intensity and commitment that we do them in Ramadan. So we did all of these things. We made a concerted effort to pray more, to make more dhikr, to make more dua, to make the night prayer, to stay up at night in the last 10 days of Ramadan. Some of us may have made an itikaf, or at least for part of the last 10 days, whatever it was. We did all these things. And we still, in spite of doing these things, we still had to work. We still had to go to school. We still had to take care of our families. We still had to do those fulfill those day-to-day obligations which go hand in hand with what? With living, with life and living. But somehow, some way, we made time for what? For this worship. We still had to live, we still had to function, the rent still had to get paid, right? But not only did we worship with this extra level of intensity, we prioritized worship. We may have had to what? Do less of the things that we normally do to live in order to what? To prioritize worship. And guess what happened? Our lives didn't come to a screeching halt. The world didn't come crashing down. All of that prioritizing of worship, it didn't hurt us financially or physically. In fact, not only did we not suffer financially or physically, we what? We benefited spiritually. All of us felt a sense of nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we didn't have before what? Before Ramadan. And so basically what this is telling us is that we can prioritize. We can make Allah and His worship our priority in our daily lives and not only survive, but thrive. And so this refutes the notion that many people say when you say, why don't you come to the mosque more? Person will say, I'm just so busy with work. I just don't have time. Right? But we made time in Ramadan. There's some people who they didn't miss a night of Taraweeh in the masjid, not just in the masjid, but in the front row. They made time. If we can make time in Ramadan, we can make time outside of Ramadan. It's just a matter of what? Making a priority, but we can do it. Which brings me to the second lesson is, yes, we can. Yes, we can do more. Yes, we can improve. There's always room for improvement. And this is important because Ramadan showed us that when we're telling ourselves, this is all we can do. I can't do any more than this. Ramadan showed us that we can what? We can do more. It also showed us that it gave us something that we could compare what we normally do to what? To what we can do. And showed us that our ability and how much of our actual ability we're putting to use, there's a disparity there. How much we are doing versus what we can do. There's a disparity. And we need to try to do what? Close that gap. Then number 3 from the lessons is that we need to avoid being from those who worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only in Ramadan. Because if you look at the verses where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prescribes fasting, He tells us why He prescribed fasting. So He says, He prescribed fasting, or fasting was prescribed for the believers as it was prescribed for those who came before us, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, so that you would attain piety. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one of the lessons He wants us to learn from Ramadan is to be better Muslims in Ramadan. Is that what the message is? The whole year, right? I'm teaching you through Ramadan how to behave what? Outside of Ramadan, the rest of the year. It was not Allah's intention that we worship Him with this intensity, or that we worship Him at all, just in Ramadan and then abandon His worship outside of it. Rather, truly being Muslim means being committed for a lifetime. Being committed for a lifetime. Not a month or a few days from the month. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَعْبُدْ رَبَّكَ حَتَّى يَأْتِيَكَ الْيَقِينَ. He says, and worship your Lord until your dying day. Right? Not just in Ramadan. So we have to learn from Ramadan not to be Ramadan Muslims. Not to just worship Allah in Ramadan, because that's not what He said. I prescribed Ramadan so that you would worship me in 1 month. No, I prescribed Ramadan so you would learn to be what? Pious, devoted believers throughout the year. But number 4 from the lessons of Ramadan is the importance of patience and self-restraint. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one of the benefits of fasting that just يَتَبَادَرِ إِلَى ذِهْنِكَ, when you start saying, what's the benefit? What's the hikmah of the prescription of fasting? One of the first things people will say is it teaches us patience and self-restraint. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to learn to what? To control ourselves. He wants us to take back control of ourselves and to prevent us from allowing ourselves to be in control. To be controlled by what? Our desires and our passions. No, He wants us to be in control, to be controlled by our emotions. He wants us to exercise a sabr and learn how to control our emotions, our tempers, and control what? Our tongues, right? And this is indicated by the statement of the Prophet ﷺ, which he said, الصيام جنة فلا يرفث ولا يصخب فإن امرؤ قاتله أو شاتمه فليقل إني امرؤ صائم. He said fasting is a shield. So if one of you is fasting, then let him avoid profanity and argumentation. And if anyone insults him or tries to provoke him, then let him say, I am most certainly fasting. So the Prophet is teaching us that one of the lessons we're supposed to learn from Ramadan and from fasting and all the rituals that go with it is what? To what? To practice self-constraint, to be in control and not to be controlled by our anger, our emotions, our temperament, whatever it is. Number 5 from the lessons of Ramadan is that character matters. Character matters. One of the things that Ramadan teaches us, if we look deeply beyond the surface, is that Islam is not just about, or being a good Muslim is not just about what we believe. It's not just about who we worship. It's not just about how we worship. In many cases, what we have a tendency to do is overemphasize the nuts and bolts, the do's and don'ts, the ahkam, the fiqh, right? The material. We overemphasize that. That doesn't mean that those things are important. They are important. Our acts of worship won't be accepted if we don't do them correctly. But the acts of worship are meant to what? They're not there lidhatiha, lidawatiha. They're there for what? To purify our souls, to make us better human beings. And part of being a better human being is how you interact with others. And so people, they spend so much time focusing on what we believe, who we worship, how we worship, and not enough time focusing on how we behave, how we treat others. For example, learning important aspects of human character like empathy. That it's not just about what I do, but it's also about how what I do affects what? Affects others. The harm it could potentially cause. To the point that in our religion, we're actually told not to do certain things that are what? Religious, because of the harm they could potentially cause. You're allowed to do it, or you're even encouraged to do it in some cases. And in this case, because it could harm someone, you're told what? Not to do it. And we gave examples. For example, in Ramadan, we talked about the hadith where the Prophet said, إِذَا كُنْتُمْ ثَلَاثَةً فَلَا يَتَنَاجَ إِثْنَانِ دُونَ صَاحِبِهِمَا فَإِنَّ ذَلِكَ يُحْزِنُهُ. If you are 3 together, don't let 2 of you go off and whisper and exclude the 3rd person from your conversation, because that puts him through distress, that causes anxiety for him, that makes him start thinking, are they plotting against me? Do they think I'm not worthy of listening to the conversation? Right? He starts to think all these thoughts. He starts to become paranoid. He starts to become fearful. The Prophet is saying this can hurt him, even though this act, whispering itself, is not prohibited. Because of the harm it can cause, it becomes what? Prohibited. Right? Our religion also teaches us we're supposed to be empathetic people. We're not supposed to be the people who, when we step on someone's shoe, when we harm someone, when we say something that they don't like, when we insult them, even inadvertently, that we're not supposed to be the people who, I'm not going to apologize, I don't care, who are you, what's the big deal? We're not supposed to be like that. But rather we're supposed to put ourselves in their shoes. We're supposed to have empathy and say, yeah, if somebody insulted me and hurt my feelings, even if they didn't understand why, I want them to just say what? I'm sorry, my bad, etc. As the Prophet said in the hadith, he said, لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه. None of you truly believe and loves for his brother what he loves for himself. And so one of the things that we're supposed to learn from Ramadan is character and caring and kindness and these types of things that many people what? They push to the side as saying not being part of the deen. The deen is just what? What we do, who we worship. That's it. The proof that that's not the case is that the Prophet said in the hadith, ليس الصيام he said, ليس الصيام الأكل والشرب وإنما الصيام من اللغو والرفث. He said, fasting is not merely abstaining from food and drink, rather it is abstaining from ignorant and indecent speech. He said it's more about what? Character than it is about what? About the actual nuts and bolts, to the point that sometimes if your nuts and bolts are good, but your character is bad, your fasting won't be what? Accepted. Shows you it's not just about not eating and drinking. The Prophet said in the hadith, من لم يدع قول الزور والعمل به والجهل فليس لله حاجة أن يدع طعامه وشرابه. He said, whoever does not abandon, while fasting, falsehood in word and deed and sinful behavior, then Allah has no need that he should abandon his food and drink. You guys see that? And the statement that's attributed to Jabir radiallahu anhu, he said, إذا سمت فليسم سمعك وبصرك ولسانك عن الكذب والمحارم ودعنك أذى الجار وليكن عليك وقار وَسَكِينَةٍ. He said, if you fast, then let your hearing and your sight fast as well, and let your tongue fast from lying and other illegal activity. Avoid mistreating your neighbor. Be dignified and calm. People, if somebody said when you fast, you should, if you just said, okay, fasting, part of fasting is being nice to your neighbor. Do you make a one-to-one connection to that? We typically don't. But Jabir says, yeah, that's part of what? Part of fasting. Your behavior is a big part of what fasting. We have to learn that the ritual is more than just what? Not eating and drinking. Your behavior, how you conduct yourself is a big part of it. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger, they're expecting us to learn from Ramadan and from fasting how to be kinder, how to be more polite, how to be more considerate, more compassionate, more respectful, more decent, more upright, etc. and so on, to be empathetic. And if we haven't learned that, then we missed the point, in a sense, of Ramadan. But number 6 from the lessons is that fasting is not just good for the body, it's even better for what? For the soul, right? For the heart, for the soul. Some of the scholars have mentioned that a very pious man from the children of Israel, he used to say to his companions whenever they were about to break their fast, he would say, Ya ikhwati, la ta'kulu kathiran, fatashrabu kathiran, fatanamu kathiran, fatakhsaru kathira. He used to say, oh my brothers, don't eat too much, for that will cause you to drink too much, which will lead you to sleep too much, which will lead you, which will result in you losing too much. What do you mean by losing too much?
Missing too much.
Missing too much what? If you eat and drink till you're full, what happens? You get sleepy. If you get sleepy and you're sleeping with a full stomach, is it easy to wake up? So if you'll spend all that time sleeping that you could have been spending drawing closer to Allah, right? And so basically what he's saying is that we lose the opportunity to draw closer to Allah when we spend too much time what? Filling our stomachs. So a big part of what holds a lot of us back, and we have to realize this, and we don't have the energy necessary to worship Allah, is that we have a tendency to what? To overeat or to overconsume. Sometimes it's not just the eating and drinking part of it, it's just, consuming other things. Could be consuming social media, could be consuming television, could be consuming what? Going shopping and buying things. We spend too much time feeding what? Our desires, our physical desires. And this makes us what? Lazy. And deprives us of the spiritual energy to do good and to avoid evil, to resist temptation, etc. And what Ramadan teaches us, if we pay attention to it, is it teaches us that if we want to be in control of our religion, we must first learn to control what? Our appetite. Our appetite for all things. See that? And that's why one of the early Muslims, one of the Salaf, Ibrahim ibn Adham, he used to say, "Man ضبط بطنه ضبط دينه, ومن ملك جوعه ملك الأخلاق الصالحة, وإن المعصية بعيدة عن الجائع, قريبة من الشبعان." He used to say, the one who is able to control his stomach is in command of his religion. And whoever bridles his hunger will possess righteous character. Certainly, disobedience of Allah is nearest to the one who has a full stomach and furthest away from the one who is hungry, right? So if we learn that, that's why the Prophet encouraged us that if we're going to fill our stomachs, we should do what? Fill a third of it with food, a third of it with drink, and then leave what? A third empty for easy breathing. Why? Because you're in control now. Food is in control of me, I'm in control. A third, I'm done. And I have what? The energy and the ability to move about, worship Allah, and do the things I need to do. But number 7, from the lessons, is that husbands and wives are supposed to be a team striving together for good. And we see this jaliyan. We see this in the practice of the Prophet ﷺ in Ramadan, particularly in the last 10 days of Ramadan, and some of his statements that he made in general. So for example, Aisha radiallahu anha, when she described the Prophet ﷺ in the last 10 days of Ramadan, she said, one of the things she said about him was, أحيا ليلة وأيقظ أهله. That he was in the habit of spending the entire night in worship, And he would awaken his family to do what? To do the same. So he wouldn't just go off and do his thing and leave them to figure it out themselves. But what? It was a team. It was teamwork. He would do what? To the point, not just, look at this, not just even his own wives. He would go to the home of his daughter and son-in-law. Knock at the door. ألا تقوم الليل. ألا تقوم الليل. Are you guys not going to get up for the night prayer? Okay? And so it's important for couples specifically to be what? To be a team working together for good, and Ramadan teaches us that. And we have the famous statement of the Prophet ﷺ, which he said, رَحِمَ اللَّهُ رَجُلًا قَامَ مِنَ اللَّيْلِ فَصَلَّى وَأَيْقَظَ امْرَأَتَهُ فَإِنْ أَبَتْ نَضَحَ فِي وَجْهِهَا الْمَاءِ وَرَحِمَ اللَّهُ امْرَأَةً قَامَتْ مِنَ اللَّيْلِ فَصَلَّتْ وَأَيْقَظَتْ زَوْجَهَا فَإِنْ أَبَى نَضَحَتْ فِي وَجْهِهِ الْمَاءِ. So in this hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, he praised a couple, and he said, may Allah have mercy upon a man who wakes up to offer the night prayer. And he prays. But he also does what? He wakes up his wife to do the same. And if she what? She refuses and struggles to awaken, he does what? He sprinkles some water in her face just to help her what? To help her, basically revive herself or become energized. And he said, conversely, may Allah have mercy upon a woman who does the same thing. Gets up to offer the prayer, goes to wake up her husband to do the same. And if he refuses, she does what? She sprinkles some water in his face to help him to what? يَتَنَشَّطْ, to get up and to offer prayer as she did. And so it's important for couples to take from Ramadan this renewed commitment to work what? To work together and to help each other to do more of what pleases Allah, to advise each other, to encourage each other, to set an example for each other, to remind each other, etc. And last but not least, from the lessons that I wanted to share today is that Islam seeks to unite the Muslims. And we can see this, we can see this from a number of the prophets at hadith where he talks about unity in Ramadan and how Ramadan is supposed to bring the Muslims together. So for example, we have the famous hadith where the Prophet said, as-sawmu yawma tasumun wal-fitru yawma tuftirun. He said, fasting is on the day that all of you fast. And the breaking of the fast is on the day that all of you break fast. Meaning you should do what? You should fast together as a community and break fast together as a community. And Ibn Umar, he used to say, as-sawmu ma'al jama'a wal-fitru ma'al jama'a. He used to say that fasting and the breaking of the fast is with the collective body of the Muslims. And so what this teaches us is that our religion is a religion of unity and togetherness and not a religion of disunity and schism. And that doesn't mean that we're not going to have differences, that we won't have differences. But what it does mean is that there is a certain way that we're expected to deal with our differences, and that no good comes from being disagreeable and contrary. That some people, they want to go against the grain, and they want to make things which are not deal breakers, they want to make them deal breakers. They want to make things which are not justifications for schism. They want to make them the reason why what? I'm not going to associate, I won't participate, I won't cooperate, I'll oppose, I'll refute, etc. And this is what Ibn Mas'ud meant when he was reported to have said, كما علقه البخاري, he said, الخلاف كله شر. He said, differing, all of it is evil. Okay, and in many cases, when we differ and become disagreeable, yes, nothing but what? Evil ensues. And so many people, when differences occur, what do? They unleash their what? Their tongues. And they speak indiscriminately. I disagree with you, and so now what? I'm going to say things that are cruel, that are abusive, that are unfair. And a lot of times we lose the ability to be just when we're upset with someone or we disagree with someone. They don't hold our opinion. And they talk, we have a tendency when we differ to talk about people instead of talking what? Talking to them, right? And how do you solve a disagreement by talking about a person and talking to them, right? It doesn't. You'll never get it resolved. And so it just what? It festers and it gets what? Worse and worse. And so rather than try to understand them, we tend to do what? Demean and discredit. I don't want to understand your opinion. I just want to do what? I want to tell everybody why they shouldn't listen to you, right? Why your opinion is stupid or it's invalid or it's not credible, etc. And no good can come from this either. And perhaps this is an extension of what Ibn Mas'ud meant when he said, Al-khilaf kulluhu shar. You know what I mean? When this is what happens. When people disagree and differ, and that's the result. So this final lesson that I'm sharing with you from Ramadan It teaches us that we're supposed to work diligently to narrow the gap between us and not widen it, and bring our hearts together and not to tear them apart. This is very critical for us to learn this lesson, that a lot of people getting together in a community setting, there's going to be some friction. But we have to learn to manage that. We have to learn to prioritize unity to the best of our ability, because we're better and stronger together. And what saddens me is that no matter how many lectures are given about this, no matter how many ayat Allah has revealed about this, no matter how many hadith are mentioned about this, for some reason, Muslims naturally like to do what? They like to go off. And sometimes, I'm not saying there are not situations where some people just feel like the only way they can survive, they can maintain their sanity, is to go off. But we shouldn't create that type of circumstance where the only choice a person has to maintain their sanity is to what? Is to go somewhere else, to go off into the woods with their sheep. You follow what I'm saying? We shouldn't create that circumstance. We have to try to do what we can to diffuse and to minimize conflict and work together, because we're stronger together, we're more effective together. That being said, we'll transition here to talk about the rules for fasting the 6 days of Shawwal. And these rules pretty much revolve and center around one hadith. And that's the hadith collected by Muslim on the authority of Abu Ayyub Al-Ansari, in which the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Man sama Ramadan, thumma atba'ahu sittan min Shawwal, kana kasiyam ad-dahr." He said, whoever fasts the month of Ramadan and then thereafter follows the fast of Ramadan with 6 days of fasting from Shawwal, it would be equivalent to fasting the whole year. Now, before we reflect upon this hadith and talk about the ahkam that we derive from it, I want to digress a little bit and say that nowadays we hear different opinions about this hadith and how it should be applied, and fatwa that tell people in this circumstance you can fast, there's an exception here, there's an exception there. They create all these exceptions and concessions, etc. And it's important for us to understand a few principles before we start to contemplate the hadith and try to draw the right conclusions about the meaning of the hadith and how it's supposed to be applied, and what ahkam, what prerequisites and conditions and rules and regulations it indicates. And that is that from the qawaid al-usuliyah, from the epistemological principles of our religion, is that the basic rule of interpretation of religious texts, the statements of Allah and His Messenger, is that they are to be interpreted literally, right? Unless there is credible evidence to indicate that some other non-literal meaning is intended. Let me say that again. That basically, if Allah and His Messenger tell us something, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, for example, He says, وَقَالَتِ الْيَهُودُ يَدُ اللَّهِ مَغْلُولَةٌ غُلَّتْ أَيْدِيهِمْ وَلُعِنُوا بَلْ يَدَاهُ مَبْسُوطَتَانِ يُنْفِقُ كَيْفَ يَشَاءُ. So in this ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, and the Jews say that the hand of Allah is tied up. May their hands be tied up, and may they be cursed. Bel, nay, His hands, His two hands, are mabsutatan. They are what? They're outstretched. Yunfiqu kayfa yasha. He spends however He wills. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in a verse, attributes to Himself hands, we take that what? Literally, He has hands. But we also understand that those hands are not like what? The hands of His creatures, right? And they're hands which befit His majesty. You guys see that? طيب. And we don't have the right to say, no. Hands means what? Ni'matah. It means His two bounties, right? It means quwwatah. It means His two what? His two strengths. We don't have a right to say that unless we have credible evidence that a non-literal meaning is what? Is intended instead of what? The literal meaning. What would be an example of credible evidence? One example would be the Prophet ﷺ, his practice is contrary to what? The statement of Allah and His Messenger, the literal statement of Allah and His Messenger. So for example, the Prophet said in one hadith, He said, لا يشربن أحد منكم قائما. He said, don't let a single one of you stand up and what? And drink. But the Prophet was seen standing up and what? Drinking. The literal meaning, what first occurs to your mind, the Prophet says, nobody should stand up and drink. You think it's what? It's haram. But then when you see him do it, you know it's not what? Haram. It must be what? Makruh, disliked. You guys see that? That's credible evidence that lets us know that the literal meaning isn't intended because the Prophet wouldn't do something haram. Another example is that the same as the companions. The Prophet says something, and that indicates to us something, and then they say something to the contrary, or they do something to the contrary. So for example, the Prophet said in one hadith, وَأَعْفُوا اللِّحَا. He said, and what? And let your beards grow. And the word he used, al-i'fa, it basically means what? To let something go and don't what? Don't touch it, don't anything to it. So that would basically mean that you never cut what? You never cut or trim your beard. That would be the basic literal meaning of it. But we have companions, many of them, a number of them. Among them Ibn Umar and Abu Hurairah, who used to do what? They would take their beard, and whatever went beyond a hand's grasp, they would do what? They would cut it. And they would do that what? On the bottom of it, and also what? On the sides. So that tells you that when they heard the Prophet say, وَأَعْفُوا اللِّحَا, they didn't understand it to mean that you can't trim it, but they understood it to mean what? That you can trim it as long as you don't trim it less than what? A qabdah. That's how they understood it. You guys see that? Another example is the Prophet ﷺ, he told us in one hadith, he said, لا توتروا بثلاث تشبه الوتر المغرب, or تشبه المغرب الوتر المغرب, yeah, تشبه المغرب, or تشبه المغرب, أنا آسف. So he said, don't offer the witr prayer in a way that resembles maghrib. If you listen to that and you take the literal meaning of it, you say it's not permissible to what? To offer witr the way we make maghrib, which means what? You make 3 raka'at, 2 sittings, and 1 taslima. You guys see that? You can't do that. But we have the statement of Ibn Mas'ud and other of the companions in which they said or indicated al-witru kal maghrib. Which means what? They didn't understand the Prophet's statement the way that the literal meaning. And you can go on. And al-muhim, the only time we can deviate from the literal meaning or depart from the literal meaning is if we have evidence to the contrary, credible evidence to the contrary. So that being said, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioned, they mention a virtue. They mention a virtue for a deed. Whoever does this will get this, provided, right? They say whoever does this will get this reward provided A, B, C, and D. The literal meaning of that hadith is what? You can't get this unless you do this and fulfill all of these what? Conditions. Somebody says, no. You only have to fulfill 3 of those. They would have to have what? Proof. Because we have to take what they said at their face. If they make something a condition for a virtue, they know what they're saying. They know what they're saying, and it's not for us to say, no, they didn't mean that. Unless we have proof to the contrary. You guys see that? But that being said, let's go back now, and I want you to help me with this. Let's contemplate the hadith and the meanings of the words of the hadith. What occurs to your mind when you hear the Prophet say X, Y, and Z? And then let's go back based upon those ma'ani, those meanings, and determine what's the fiqh of the hadith. What are the conditions and prerequisites to get this ajr? So the Prophet starts out and he says, man, which literally means whoever. Whoever. What's the fiqh of that? What do you take from that? When the Prophet says man, whoever. What do you take from that? Huh? Everybody. Male, female. Young, old. Anybody who is fast eligible. Is that not so? Anybody who is fast eligible. Right? If they're eligible to fast, they can get this reward. Whoever. Everybody agree with that? Anybody disagree with that? That's the first meaning of, okay, so whoever. Then he says, Sama Ramadan. What's the meaning that? يتبادل لذهنك. Sama Ramadan. Fast Ramadan, 20 days of Ramadan. 22 days of Ramadan. If the Prophet says Sama Ramadan, what does he mean Ramadan? He means Ramadan Kamilan. Everybody agree with that? He means Ramadan Kamilan. Right? You have to fast Ramadan. You guys see that? In its entirety. Then he said, Thumma. and then thereafter. And then thereafter. What occurs to you there? What's the meaning of that?
You have to finish your Ramadan fast.
That this
Then that.
that's coming has to follow what? This that's already been mentioned. You guys see that? He says, Man sama Ramadan thumma. That you have to do this first before you can do what? Before you can do this. In order to get what? This. You guys see that? It establishes the word thumma. It literally is a word in Arabic that establishes what? Exactly. It means that one thing had to follow what? Another, and it had to follow with what? Somewhat. There was somewhat. Some distance between it. It wasn't even immediate. Right? They didn't happen at the same what? Time. Meaning you can't fast Shawwal while you're doing what? Ramadan. You guys see that? That one has to what? Come after the other by what? By some distance. If I say, for example, Ja Ahmed wa Zayd. Ahmed and Zayd came. It means what? They came at the same time. If I said Ja Ahmed thumma Zayd, it means Ahmed came and then after some time, Zayd came. That's the meaning of thumma. Do you think the Prophet Arabi? The Prophet, he's the one who establishes what is the Arabic language by his words. We go back to his words and say, this is Arabi and this is not Arabi. You think he doesn't know the difference between wa fa, wa thumma? So when he says thumma, he meant thumma. That this thing has to come what? Come after this thing. Then he says, atba'hu. Follows it. Atba'hu. Follows it. Like, what is it? Ramadan kamilan. Ramadan in its entirety. Then he says, atba'hu, follows it. That's what? Ta'keedan. Ta'keedan. It further emphasizes what he said previously when he said thumma. Let you know that this has to follow what? This. You guys see that? طيب, ثم بعد ذلك he says, atba'hu sittan min Shawwal. Sittan min Shawwal. What do you take from that? What's the fiqh?
It has to be 6.
Has to be 6. Can't be what? 5 or 4 or 3. You guys see that? To get this what? This ajr. And it has to occur when? In Shawwal. It has to occur in Shawwal. Not 5 days in Shawwal and 1 day in Dhul Qa'dah. You guys see that? Has to occur what? In Shawwal. You got a month to do it. It's up to you. But if you do it, you'll get this reward. If you choose to do 5 and do 1 outside, you won't get this reward. Will you get a reward? Absolutely. But not what? Not this reward, because the Prophet gave what? These shurut. What is the reward? كَانَ كَالصِّيَامِ الدَّهْرِ. It will be equivalent to fasting the whole year. This is the reward one can expect to gain from this fast, provided that he or she fills the following conditions. What are the conditions? Number 1, he or she is fast eligible. Somebody who's not permitted to fast, not allowed to fast, or their fast won't be accepted. They can't fast 6 days of Shawwal and expect this reward because they're not fast eligible. Then number 2, he or she has completed the fasting of Ramadan and made up any missed days. Because why? The Prophet said, Man sama Ramadan. Let's say, for example, that a man fasted in Ramadan for 4 days. So on the day of Eid, he's fasted how many days?
4.
Now, how many days has he fasted? It was a 30-day Ramadan. 26 days he fasted.
Except 4 days. We thought you said 4 days.
I'm sorry. Okay, so I'm sorry. Maybe I said it wrong. It's my fault. Let me go back. Let me rewind, okay? So a man traveled. Fasted the whole month of Ramadan, but he fasted for 4 days. So for those 4 days, because he had the concession, he didn't fast. So comes Yom al-Eid, and he's fasted how many days? 26 days. Mumtaz. Type Shawwal comes. So day 2 of Shawwal. Can he fast on, by the way, can he fast on Eid? No fasting on Eid, right? Totally prohibited. But he can fast on the 2nd day of Shawwal. The 2nd day of Shawwal, he says, Anwi Siyam Shawwal. He says, I intend to fast Shawwal. Can he do that? No. Why can't he do it? Because what? He still has how many? 4 days left on Ramadan. He hasn't fasted Ramadan. The Prophet said, Man sama Ramadan kamilan. ثم اتبعه ستا من شوال. Then number 3, the third condition is he or she has to fast how many days? 6 days. At least 6 days, right? And all those days have to occur when? In Shawwal. Those are the 4 conditions. You have fatwa where a person says, no, you can fast any time of the year. So for example, a sister will write to an imam and say, yeah, imam, I missed 8 days from Ramadan. I missed 8 days from Ramadan. I missed 10 days from Ramadan because of, my period. And I got busy, and now there's only 10 days left from Shawwal. If I do 8 days of Ramadan, there won't be enough time to do 6 days of Shawwal. Can I do 6 days of Shawwal and then make up my Ramadan after? You have imams saying, yeah, you can do it. You can do that. You can do that. So they're putting what? Shawwal before what? Ramadan. One of the things that tells you this is wrong, one is the literal wording of the Prophet ﷺ. But on top of that, Abu Hurairah, someone came to him and asked him about this, a similar scenario. Said they had something left from Ramadan and they wanted to fast the 10 days of Muharram, the first 10 days or the first 9 days of Muharram. Could they do that? Abu Hurairah said, Ibda bima faradallahu alayk. He said, begin with what? With what Allah has obligated upon you. Don't put the recommended before, because the recommended is just that. It's recommended. You meet Allah and you don't have it, you won't be held accountable for it. But if you meet Allah, you don't have those days of fasting in Ramadan, you'll be what? Held accountable. طيب, another example, a similar scenario. Well, you get the point. The point is that you have to do the fasting of Shawwal in Ramadan. In Shawwal, the fasting of the 6 days in Shawwal. But you have to do it after what? After you make up what? Ramadan. طيب, few notes, and then we'll offer an opportunity for some questions really quickly. Number 1, these days, they don't have to be consecutive. They don't have to be consecutive, which means you could fast on a Monday. Fast then on a Thursday. You could fast Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Take a break. Right? Just as long as you get 6 days in Shawwal, that's all you have to do. Number 2, these days are not mandatory, but they are highly what? Highly recommended. In fact, this is, if not the most virtuous fast after Ramadan, it's one of the most virtuous. Why? Because it's connected to what? A faridah. And Ibn Rajab, he mentioned that the best acts of worship are those which are connected with what? A faridah. So when you look at the prayers, there's lots of sunnah prayers, isn't there? There's al-duha, there's the qiyam al-layl, right? There's tahiyat al-masjid. There's all these recommended prayers that we make, right? There's the prayer that we should make after we make wudu, etc. But the best sunnah prayers, he said, are the rawatib. Are the ones that we make before dhuhr and after dhuhr, before maghrib, after isha, before fajr. Because why? They're connected with what? A faridah. Same thing with what? 6 days from Shawwal. Connected with what? The fasting of Ramadan. That's what? Boosted in virtue. Makes it one highly recommended, highly encouraged, and it's just 6 days. And 6 days in exchange for which you get credit as if you fasted 360 days. Come on, you just can't beat it. Can't beat it. Somebody tells you, hey, 6 will get you 360. You'll be doing what? You'll be doing it all day long, wouldn't you? So the same thing here, it's really virtuous. We should do it, but we don't have to do it. Not obligated to do it. The last one, a person, because it's not obligatory, a person's amiru nafsi. It's up to him. He can choose to fast or not to fast. He can even choose to initiate the fast. Wake up one morning, and he feels what? Nasheet, qawi. I can do this today. And he gets about halfway through the day, and because of work or stress or maybe allergies or something comes on, and he feels like I can't make it through the day. He can break his fast. He can break that fast because it's supererogatory. It's voluntary. He can break that fast. Amiru nafsi. Anytime he makes the niyyah to do a voluntary fast, he's amiru nafsi. So you understand that as well. But again, these are 6 days that we'll get in exchange for it reward as if we fasted every day of the year. We should do it. And for some of the sisters, it's difficult because they have to make up days from Ramadan, and they're making them up in the time where the days are getting what? Longer and longer. And a sister may say, I want to wait and put off making up my days until the days are shorter. And she can do that. She's at liberty to do that. But if she does that, she'll miss out on what? The opportunity to fast 6 days that will give her the reward for what? For 360 days. طيب, so with that, we'll bring today's session to a close. Any questions, comments, or critiques before we close out? تفضلي.
So there are specific days like during the month that we fast during the week, Mondays and Thursdays,
Mhm.
13, 14, and 15.
Yeah.
So when you fasting in Shawwal, you're making your intentions with it. You can't say like I'm fasting in 6 days of day of Shawwal and trying to get the blessings of the 13, 14, and 15.
Wallahi, there are some days of fasting where all that is intended to get the reward, or all that's needed to get the reward, is for fasting to occur on that day. And there are days of fasting where you have to intend that particular fast. So in the case of Mondays and Thursdays, you get the reward for fasting on what? On that day. So you could have what? A dual intention, if you want to put it that way. So you could fast on a Monday with the intention of Shawwal and with the intention of what? Of getting the reward for fasting on Monday. And you could get that reward. Why? Because the fast on Monday, the only thing that's required is that the fast occur on that day. But you have other fasts where, you have to intend that particular fast. And so in those cases, you couldn't have a dual intention because it would be one or the other. Yeah. But any other questions? Like, for example, if you had an oath, you made an oath to fast, right? And so this is a debt that you created with, a spiritual debt that you created with yourself and Allah. And then you say, okay, you know what? I want to fast Shawwal and that oath and get 2 for 1. You couldn't do that. Yeah. تفضل. تفضل.
Can you fast on Fridays?
Absolutely.
No.
But if you fast you shouldn't single out Friday as a day of fasting. But you can fast on Friday. And one of the evidences that you can fast on Friday is that the Prophet ﷺ, in one hadith, I think it was Hafsa. He came to her on a Saturday and she was fasting. She informed him that she was fasting. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said, did you fast yesterday? Yesterday would have been what? She said, no, it was Saturday. So yesterday would have been Friday. She said, no. He said, do you intend to fast tomorrow? Tomorrow would have been what? Sunday. He said, then break your fast. Right? She said, no in both cases. He said, then break your fast. As if to say, don't single out what? Saturday as a day of fasting. But what that tells you is that you could fast when? Because he asked her, did you fast yesterday? Which means she could have fasted Friday and Saturday, or she could have fasted Saturday and Sunday. She's just not supposed to single out what? Saturday as a day of fasting.
You mean Friday?
No. The Prophet came to Hafsa on a Saturday
A Saturday, okay.
and asked her. She said, I'm fasting. She informed him, I'm fasting. The Prophet said, did you fast? Yesterday would have been what? Which indicates that she could have fasted. It was permissible for her to fast. She said, no. He said, do you intend to fast tomorrow? Which is what? Sunday. She said, no. He said, then break your fast. As if to tell her, don't single out Saturday for fasting. Fast it with Friday. Fast it with Sunday. But don't fast Saturday by itself. But in a roundabout way, what is the Prophet telling her? You can fast on Friday.
Can you single out Friday though?
He didn't indicate you couldn't.
Oh.
He didn't indicate you couldn't.
All right.
Okay? So if you're fasting the 6 days of Shawwal and you wanted to do them all 6 together, and you start on Monday, that would necessitate that you fasted what? Into Saturday.
Oh, okay.
You see that?
And the reason being was that Saturday was the Jewish Sabbath.
Some of the scholars say that he didn't mention the illah, he didn't mention the reason, but some of the scholars say, yeah, that was the reason why. But they didn't specify, or he didn't specify in the hadith. The other thing too is that you can fast on Friday and Saturday, etc., if there's a sabab, like the 6 days of Shawwal, like Ayyam al-Bid, the 13th, 14th, and 15th of each lunar month, like the first 9 days of Muharram. Like some people think you have to break your fast on Saturday. You can't fast. Then how would you fast all 9 days? How would you fast 6 days consecutively? Which the scholars say you can do. And so what that proves is that, yes, you can fast on Saturday, but you're not supposed to single out Saturday what? For fasting, yeah.
So where did the Friday come from? Like,
What did the what about Friday?
About not being able to single out Friday.
Who said that?
You actually, so he asked, is it okay to fast Friday? You said yes, but you shouldn't single out or target.
What I meant by that was, okay, maybe the wording was poor. What I meant by that is like a person shouldn't fast on Friday with regularity as if there's some virtue in fasting on Friday. But if it occurs for some reason, there's a sebab, there's a reason, then yeah, you can fast on that.
Oh,
So can you fast Thursday, Friday, Saturday?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Clear.
Thank you, Hamza, for clearing that because I did say that. Atfadal Abu Khadija.
If a person wakes up at noontime and he intends to fast, is it okay?
If it's a voluntary fast, absolutely. Absolutely. There's a
For the Shawwal.
yeah, so if it's a voluntary fast like Shawwal, then he can absolutely make his niyyah from any time during what? An-nahar, right? Anytime during the daytime. So before Asr, anytime before that, if he made a niyyah, it would be what? That day of fasting would be acceptable, provided he hadn't what? Eaten or drank anything prior to that. And the proof for that is that the Prophet ﷺ, in one occasion, he came to his home and he asked, do you guys have something to eat? And his families replied, there's nothing. So he said, Inni idhan sa'im. He said, then I'm fasting. And the scholars have interpreted that to mean what? Ansha'a niyya min dhak al-waqt. That from that time, and it was during the daytime, since there was nothing to eat, he was like, I might as well get the reward and fast. But then he came another time, and he said, is there something to eat? And they said, yes. And he ate, and he broke his fast, right? And so that teaches us two things. The hadith benefits us in two ways. One, it benefits us that you can, like you said, if it's a supererogatory fast and it's during the daytime, you can start your niyyah from any time, provided you haven't eaten or drank anything prior to that. It also teaches us that you're what? Amiru nafsik. If you're fasting a supererogatory fast, a voluntary fast, and you decide to what? To break it, right? You can break it because the Prophet in this case, he broke his fast, yeah. طيب, any other questions, comments, critiques? Going once. Tafadhal, Shaykh.
During Ramadan, you need to make your intention before Fajr that you're gonna.
Yeah, Ramadan is special. Ramadan is special. The Prophet, there's two narrations, one from Hafsa, one from Ibn Umar, and both of them have hukm al-rafa. Both of them are elevated to the status of a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, in which they said that the Prophet ﷺ said, or basically they learned from the Prophet, La siyama liman lam yubayyit an-niyya min layl. That there's no fast for the one who does not have the intention to fast at some part of the night, which means what? Before Fajr.
What happens if the person, for some reason, forgot to make that intention?
Well, again, the intention is something that is in the heart. It's not something we necessarily verbalize. And in many cases, we're making it, right? We're making it in different ways. So, for example, when you go home and you set your alarm clock to wake up for suhoor, that's what? That's the intention, right? When you take out that steak and you tell your wife, hey, I want steak and eggs for breakfast, that's what? That's the intention, right? When you say, if I get up at this time and have suhoor and this, that, the other, I'm not going to have time to take a shower in the morning. Let me take a shower now. That's what? The intention. All of those things are intention without you having to say a word. Your actions are indicative that what? You've resolved to fast. So in many cases, we've made the intention, okay? And if we reflect upon our behavior, we know, yeah, I had every intention, yeah, to fast. Even if you slept through suhoor, you still what? You said intention to fast. Yeah. طيب. Any other questions? Going once? Going twice? Gone. Jazakumullah khair. Thank you all for coming. Hada wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. And some people might asking, are we going to go back to Tawheed? We are. But I just thought the first lesson back, there were some important points that we should touch on. But now that we've dealt with that, inshallah ta'ala, next week we'll resume our commentary on Kitab at-Tawheed. Hada wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak Muhammad.